I'm going to be very quick because we're running a little bit behind schedule. My job this afternoon is just really to say a few words about the patient survey that we did for EHE, which we started a couple of months ago. Why did we do that? Simply because, you know, we are aware as a patient group of the growing body of work suggesting that sirolimus is useful in handling EHE, not in all cases, but in some cases is having a good effect. It is not, however, approved as a drug for the treatment of EHE. That means it can only be accessed off-label. And if your doctor won't give you a drug off-label, or his hospital won't allow him to, or his health system won't allow it to, you won't be able to access the drug. Even if all of those things are possible, the health system and your insurance may not fund it because it's off-label. So if we can get the drug approved for the treatment of EHE, those barriers to its access go away for patients, and that's what we're trying to achieve. We are currently in the process of seeking approval from the European Medicines Agency for sirolimus for the treatment of EHE. You can't just ring them up and say, can we do this, please? You have to submit a substantial amount of data. There are two sources of data. There's published data, and the regulators like published data because typically it's been peer reviewed and they feel comfortable that it's not biased in any way. However, there is another critical part of the data that's available, and that's patient curated data. And that's particularly important for a disease like EHE, because while we're thrilled with all the papers we're seeing for EHE, it's tiny compared to more common diseases. So the published data is very limited, and our patient community provide potentially really valuable data if we can collate it and present it. And that's why we launched the survey. We got 122 patients who responded, which was absolutely fantastic. You can see where they all came from on the map here. We had 42 patients who had experience with EHE, 27 still taking it, 14 patients who'd taken it but stopped taking it. That's an important group. We'll talk about that in a minute. And 80 patients who had never taken it, but that's also important, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The first thing we wanted to do was show that our patient group was a fair and a good representation of the EHE disease. And what you can see here is a presentation we did where we were able to graphically show the presentation by patient numbers of all those who took part. And you will have seen that Dr. Wilkie had a pie chart, very similar pie chart, showing this distribution. And I was trying to quickly work out if it matched what we had here, and I think it was pretty similar. And this is important because we want the regulator to trust that the patient cohort we're presenting is a realistic group of the disease. Let's look at the 17 patients who are still on the drug. What we wanted to understand is what the drug was doing, and we've got to accept that 17 patients still on the drug probably are seeing positive results. And what we saw was that a majority of those patients had either achieved stability or in some cases shrinkage. We had one patient who showed mixed treatment response, which we see with other drugs as well. But actually a good response in terms of the treatments. The other thing we looked at was the time that people were on sirolimus, because in other drugs, what we see is that they can have a positive effect, but sometimes that can be quite limited in duration, and then the effect goes away. With sirolimus, what we're seeing is a growing number of patients where the drug is successful, and again, I have to stress it's not always successful, but where it is, that this is sustainable for a number of years. And you can see here the presentation of those patients, with some patients who've been on the drug for over 5 years. So that's very good. We think for people who are on the drug for less than six months, which is one group here, they're probably in the evaluation phase, but certainly when we look at the 1 year and beyond, we're pretty sure that we're looking at patients who are seeing a great response. So that was very good news. I said those were 17 patients who were on the drug who had not had any form of transplant. We also had 10 patients who were on the drug who had had a transplant. We have to separate those because they're on the drug primarily as an immunosuppressant. And so we have to be careful presenting the data because we certainly don't want to be accused of any form of bias. What we see here is an annotation of the 10 patients, all of them, most of them stable. You'll see that there was one patient who was stable, but then showed some growth in their EHE after 10 years. And so what that demonstrates is that the stability we're seeing may just be because they had a transplant, but it may also have something to do with the fact that they're on sirolimus. Now, this was a very simple survey, so we couldn't drill down into their clinical records to try and understand this better. But that would be something we could do if we had more data. Whoops. Okay, 14 patients, we said, stopped taking sirolimus. This is a really important group in any presentation because it demonstrates that we are not hiding the negative outcomes. There is no bias here. It's a fair reflection of the data that we've gathered from those 122 patients. We can see here that in some cases, people came off the drug because their EHE was progressing. There's cases where the doctors felt they needed something more aggressive, which probably means that, again, that their EHE was progressing. We have patients who had to come off it because of bad side effects. So, as I keep saying, it doesn't work in all cases. We need to recognize this. So we are certainly never saying that sirolimus is the answer for EHE. We also had 80 patients who have not engaged with sirolimus, and we wanted to understand why that was. And particularly, we were interested in two subgroups. One is people who have been told they could not have the drug because it was not approved, so they would not be prescribed the drug off-label. And you can see in our red box on this slide, the smaller red and green bars on the left of the red dotted box are patients who were told that they could not have the drug because it was off-label. Slightly more worrying is the large number of people on the right of the red box who confirmed that the drug had never been mentioned to them by their doctor. Now, that may be because the doctor is not aware of sirolimus as a drug for EHE because it's not approved. It could be that they don't want to talk about it because they know they can't prescribe it, and so they don't want to have that discussion. It may be that there were genuinely reasons why they didn't think it was applicable, and so they just didn't talk about it. But what we hope is that if we can get sirolimus approved, then those people who are in that red dotted box wouldn't need to worry about the issues of accessing sirolimus, perhaps, which would obviously be fantastic. Finally, we just asked our patients, because part of the ability to put patient data into these regulatory documents is because we can present a human story. You know, we can get over a message that these are just not patient numbers and statistics. These are patients who are fighting a very, very unpleasant disease, in some cases fatal. And that's, I think, a really important story that we get into this sort of documentation. And so we were really pleased. And you can see here, and maybe we're not surprised, but a huge majority of the people we asked were of the opinion that it was hugely important that patients should have access to sirolimus. So I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who filled in the survey, and just amplify what others have said in that this little survey allowed us to present information or put information into the application to the EMA that's being led by Dr. Silvia Stacchiotti. She was thrilled with this data and in fact has strongly advised us to publish this. But what really is important is that the data is there with all of you patients. And I think we've talked about the patient registry that the EHE Foundation will be starting in the coming weeks, which is absolutely fantastic. Please, please, please support it because it is such an important initiative. And just this little survey really provided some really, really useful data for the application process that we're involved with.